Hello everyone, welcome back to week 8 of Law, Crime and Punishment. This week's topic is mass incarceration, a term that we've mentioned a number of times since the beginning of the course. This week we delve deeper into the numbers in order to understand what mass incarceration really means, and we will also briefly touch on why that happened and propose several explanations. For this week, we read Visualizing Punishment, a text by Sarah Shannon and Chris Eugen, who teaches here at the U, by the way. And we also watched the Netflix documentary 13th, directed by Ava DuVernay. When we talk about mass incarceration, we refer to the dramatic and unprecedented increase in the number of incarcerated people in the US from about 200,000 in the early 1970s to more than 1.5 million in 2010. However, the raw numbers tell only part of the story, because we also have to take into account the increase in the US population over that period of time. That being the case, the more accurate measure is the incarceration rate, that is, the number of people incarcerated divided by the total population of the US. The following graph, taken from the article we read for this week, shows the increase in the incarceration rate in the US between 1970 and 2010. If we look at the brown line, we can see that in 1970, the incarceration rate in the US was about 100. That is, 100 people locked behind bars out of every 100,000 people. The rate started going up in the 1970s, and reached an all-time high of over 700 in 2010. That's a rate that is 7 times higher than it was in the 1970s. That is, if you will, mass incarceration in a nutshell. It is also important to notice the relationship between crime rates and incarceration rates. Until the early 1990s, there is a positive correlation between the two. That is, the increase in crime rates is accompanied by an increase in the incarceration rates. In other words, more crime, it seems, leads to more incarceration. That kind of makes sense. Since the 1990s, however, as we've already learned, there's been a dramatic decline in crime, and that decline did not lead to a decline in incarceration, but rather the opposite. Incarceration rates kept going up regardless of crime. Which then begs the question, why? As discussed by Michelle Alexander in the TED Talk we watched for week 4, The Future of Race in America, race is a key factor here. The following table reflects how mass incarceration is mainly a story of the disproportionate imprisonment of black people in America. Black people make up about 13% of the total US population, as can be seen on the left-hand column. However, they make up over 40% of the incarcerated population, as can be seen on the right-hand column. On the middle column, I'm sorry. On the right-hand side, we can see the incarceration rates, which tell the true and full story here. While the incarceration rate for white people is about 450 per 100,000, the rate for black people is almost 6 times higher, over 2,300 black people behind bars per 100,000. These data led many scholars to conclude that mass incarceration is, first and foremost, a project of locking up black people behind bars, a continuation of the various systems of white domination over black people in the US's long and storied history of racial conflict. That led Michelle Alexander to coin the term the new Jim Crow as a way to explain the mass incarceration of black people over the last few decades. That is a viable explanation that is discussed in the documentary 13th that we watched for this week and that you will engage with in your reading journals. It is, however, also important to keep in mind that 40% of the incarcerated population in the US is still white. In other words, mass incarceration is indeed first and foremost a story of racial domination and the incarceration of black people However, at the same time, it is not only a story of putting black people behind bars. Hundreds of thousands of white people and Hispanic people also suffered and still suffer from the punitive turn that took over the American criminal justice system starting in the 1970s. If we take another look at the total incarceration rate, we can see that it reached its peak in 2010 and has started going down a little since. Policymakers, scholars, and lay people alike have come to realize the horrific consequences of mass incarceration and its enormous costs, both on a personal, societal, and financial levels. Many states have started changing their laws and attitude towards punishment, especially with regards to drug-related crimes. Some scholars claim that we have reached a post-mass incarceration era, and although it is impossible to predict where we are going from here, it seems as if incarceration rates will be going down in the foreseeable future. It is now our task as sociologists and as informed citizens to try to figure out what happened in the US over the past 40 years. What lesson can be learned from this unprecedented boom in incarceration, and what we can do in order to mitigate the immeasurable pain and suffering caused to millions of people, white, black, Hispanic, as well as to their families and their communities from across the US. That is it for today, folks. We will continue this conversation in your reading journals and other related assignments. I hope you have a wonderful week. Take care, and bye-bye.